Yo, what's up everyone? Taylor Torrance here from Cosmic Academy, and today we are talking about EQ. Specifically, we're going to talk about 6 EQ mistakes that you might be making. I know I made these mistakes for a long time during my journey, either because I didn't know they were mistakes or because they're very tempting to do, or both. But if you can avoid these things, you're actually going to ensure that the EQ moves you make are effective and efficient, and that they're actually making your mix better as opposed to making your mix worse. Now, some of these mistakes actually, if you're doing these things, if you're kind of EQing blind without thinking about these things, you could actually be making your mix worse. So anyway, let's jump into Ableton. I want to give you guys an example for each of these 6 things so you guys can know what to avoid while you're EQing. All right, so here we are in Ableton. This is a project I've been working on for a while now, and I wanted to open a real song so that we'd have the opportunity to demonstrate a couple of these EQ mistakes to avoid in the context of a real project. A couple of them I think are better demonstrated from an example from scratch, and a couple of them we're just going to talk about. But let's start with the first big mistake to avoid, and I think this one is really the most important, and that's thinking or not thinking about where the EQ goes in the order of your processing chain or the order of your plugins on your channel. It's really important to be very intentional about where you place the EQ. So I've set up a simple example here to demonstrate this concept. I have a silent one. It's just playing a very simple sine wave. So when you play a sine wave, it's just a fundamental frequency. You'll see if I open this EQ just so we can see the waveform, and I'll take that off for now. Watch what it looks like when I play this sine wave by itself. As you can see, very simple, just one fundamental frequency there, right at around, I don't know, what is that? About 200 hertz. Okay, cool. So what I have on this chain, silent comes first, it's playing the sine wave. Then I have an EQ, then a saturator, and then this EQ that we just looked at that has nothing on it. This EQ has a high cut, right at about, let's put that at 300. Okay, because we know our fundamental frequency is about 200. Watch what happens when I play this, and I'm going to open both EQs, but I'm going to leave the saturator off. So again, this first EQ has a high cut on it at 320 hertz or so, and this last EQ in the chain has nothing on it. And I'm going to play the sine wave again. No difference, right? So even though I am cutting out the frequencies in this first EQ, there's nothing here yet, so it's not really cutting anything yet. But watch what happens when I turn on the saturator. So you'll see, even though in this first EQ that comes before the saturator, I'm cutting out all of these frequencies, because the saturator comes after this EQ with the high cut in the chain, those harmonics that are generated by the saturator are still going to be generated. There's no high cut happening to the actual sound that the harmonics that the saturator is creating, even though there's a high cut somewhere in the chain. The order matters. Let me show you what I mean what happens if I turn this high cut on to the EQ that comes after the saturator and then make that same cut at 323 hertz. Let's actually just plug that in. So it's the same high cut. We'll even make it, yep, it's 72. This one was 96. Let's make it 96. Now watch. So in the EQ that comes after the saturator, I'm getting the effect I want. If it comes before, I'm not affecting the sound that's coming out of the saturator. So think about your order when you're applying EQ. This goes for anything: reverbs, delays, compression, saturation. If you want to affect the signal that's coming out of those effects, you got to put the EQ after those plugins. If you don't want to, and you want to EQ the sound and then you want to add saturation to the sound after you've already done what you want with an EQ, put it there. And of course, you can always have more than one EQ on a channel. You can EQ it one way before the saturation and then shape the sound further with another EQ after. But just be intentional about the choice you're making about where each EQ goes in the processing chain. Okay, so mistake number 2 to avoid, and that is getting stuck in solo. So what does that mean? It means it's very tempting to solo a sound, open up an EQ, and try to get that sound sounding perfectly shaped before you place it into your group, before you place it into your song. But that is not the best way to go about EQ. And what you're going to end up with is oftentimes unnatural results, or at the very least, you're going to waste a lot of your time because you're probably going to be making moves that aren't actually making any significant audible difference in the context of your group or your whole mix. So let's take an example here. I have this drum bus and I have this one ride that if you listen to it on its own, you could definitely hear some resonant peaks in this ride. And I'll find a couple of them here in this EQ while it's soloed, and I'll show you why, even though it feels like we're actually making a difference here, it's not actually making a difference, and it's actually kind of just inefficient. But let's do it together and I'll show you what I mean. Cool. So I'm sure you guys have done this before. I have done this a lot in my life, going through, trying to find a million of these resonant peaks, right? Sweeping through, soloing things, and trying to get this sound sounding absolutely clean and perfect and just like surgically clean before I place it into the context of my group. And you can spend a lot of time doing this. You can sit here for half an hour trying to chase these gremlins, right? But listen to what happens if I play the whole drum group, okay? And I'm actually going to turn this EQ that we just went through when we found all these resonances on and off. And tell me if you're actually able to hear a difference when the whole drum group plays. I cannot hear a difference, even though if I solo this ride, let's try the same thing. So there you can hear a difference, right? You can definitely hear that we're taking out some of that resonant ringing, and it feels like we're making a big difference to the sound. But we've just proven to ourselves that in the context of the whole drum group, we are not hearing a difference. And if I play the whole song, not just the drum group, but the entire mix, there is no way that you are going to be able to hear, or any of us are going to be able to hear that difference in these notches that we've taken out. Take a listen real quick. Not going to happen, right? So you could sit here and spend half an hour on this, but it's not a great use of time. It also can actually lead to unnatural EQ results as well. So be very careful about this. I would say at a minimum, turn on solo only the group or all of the layers that you have when you're EQing an individual instrument. And even better yet, do it in the context of the whole mix to make sure that you're only making changes that are actually moving the ball forward with your music instead of getting lost in these details that aren't actually doing much for you. All right, so let's jump into mistake number 3 to avoid, and that's trying to fix a problem with an individual sound on the group or a master. This is kind of related to the last tip, but this is a really important one. So if you listen to this pad group that I have here, I'm going to solo this pad group, and what you're going to hear is another resonant kind of spiky frequency that's popping out of everything else. You hear it's kind of whistly. Take a listen. So you'll hear there's something that's whistling out, like a frequency that's popping out of that group. Now, what some people will do, or what I have done in the past, is, go on the group and say, okay, let me just be lazy here. I don't want to go through and find out which instrument is causing that issue, or even worse, go to the master because the whole song is playing and saying, oh, I've got an EQ here. Let me just be lazy and just fix it here because I don't want to have to go through the work of listening to all of the instruments in my group or whatever the context is to find where this problem is. I just want to be able to take care of it here at the master so I don't have to do all of the work. So we'll do that together right here. I can actually I'll be able to identify that resonance that's somewhere here in the mids on my master channel EQ. Let's do that together. So I see that it's right there. And what I've done on my master EQ is I've notched out by 9 dB. But the problem with doing this is that even though the problem exists on one of these pads, if I play the whole song with this EQ, listen to what else is going on in the mix. So what I'm demonstrating there is that because I've fixed that problem on the master channel, that same frequency is being notched out of the other things that are playing besides those pads. So it's notching out of this piano, it's notching out of this pad group as well. And so that's kind of where things get dangerous here, is that you're affecting the entire sound. It's like crushing like a little ant with a huge hammer, right? It's like with a sledgehammer. It's like kind of overkill, and it's actually going to create more damage to your mix than it's actually solving. So what we should do instead is we should actually go through and find the individual instrument that's kind of the source of this problem, fix it on that instrument, locate the problem, and localize our solution to the problem area so we're not affecting the other things in our mix that surround that sound. So let's jump into these instruments that are in this pad group and try to find out where this problem is originating. Okay, clearly it's on this pad number 2, and I've got an EQ here. And what I'm going to do, just like we learned in the last example, is I'm not going to stay in solo here. I'm going to solo just the pad group. And I'm going to make a move on this EQ that's on the pad 2 where the problem is, and try to fix the problem in the individual instrument while listening to the context of the whole group. So I know, okay, when do I stop notching down this frequency to where it's not making a difference anymore? Awesome. So you can hear, as I have the group soloed and I'm listening to it in context, I can hear the difference that notch is making on that resonance. So let's actually unsolo this whole group and do the same test. Let's make sure we can hear a difference on the change I made in that instrument in the context of the entire song. Awesome. So I could hear that whistle come through when I turn the notch off. When I turn the EQ notch back on, I can hear it go away, even when we're listening to the whole song. So that tells me, okay, I've localized the problem. I've fixed it here on the channel. So I'm not affecting the piano. I'm not affecting this vocal atmosphere. I'm not affecting these other pads. I'm just fixing the problem right where it starts. And I'm soloing the group in the whole, I'm listening to the whole song to make sure I'm not taking things too far in my solution to the problem. This is really the balance we want to strike when we fix problems at the source while still making sure that we're listening to the whole mix to make sure we're not going overboard. All right, guys, so let's talk about mistake number 4 to avoid. This is one that hits really close to home for me. This is not having a purpose behind the EQ moves that you're making. Or in other words, not having an intentional reason to make a particular move in your mix, especially with EQ. As a beginner, back in the day when I was starting off producing, I used to do this all the time. I would scour the internet for every producing tip I could find. You know, I'm following a bunch of channels on Instagram or on YouTube and watching tutorials and seeing people do things and seeing tips or whatever, and then just applying those same techniques in my productions without actually knowing why, or in some cases not really listening to make sure that it was the right move to make in the context of the song I was working on, right? So just because something works in one context doesn't mean it always works in every context. In every context, and most of the time it won't work, right? Because every song, every mix is very, very different. So, you know, let's take an example here on this drum group. So we heard that ride earlier that we were messing with the resonances and so on. There is a legitimate tip that, you know, in some cases works really well that says, okay, you can go and you can put a high shelf. It doesn't have to be that extreme, but you can put a high shelf on, you know, something like a ride or on any type of cymbal, and it will really add a lot of air to it. And this is a great way to get your cymbals to really slice through the mix more. That's a totally legitimate tip if it needs to be done in the context of your song. So let's, I'm going to turn this EQ off. And then when I turn it back on, this high shelf, 6 dB high shelf, is at about 5,000 hertz, is going to be applied. And this is, again, a legitimate tip. I do this in other songs if needed on some of my cymbals. But listen to what happens when I do it on this ride, and listen to the on and off, the difference in the whole mix when I turn it on and off. Right, so that ride definitely slices through the mix, but it actually overpowers the entire drum bus. So, you know, what's happening here is, okay, I'm getting the effect that the technique or the tutorial or whatever actually says I will get. It's just that in the context of this mix right now, the way that all of these elements are balanced, it doesn't need to be done. So if I left this on, I'd actually end up having to just turn this down, or I'd have a really loud ride in my mix that didn't really need to be an issue. So I'm actually creating a problem by using a technique that's actually meant to improve my mix. I'm actually making it worse or creating other problems for myself by doing this. So I think the lesson here really is just to listen carefully, try all of the techniques that you find out there, right? They all have a time, a purpose, or place. Try them out, but just make sure that they're actually the right move in the context of what you're working on. And it's totally okay to not do something even though most of the time it works well. That's all right. There are a million different ways to, you know, get the effect you want, and sometimes less is more. So try to remember that. All right, so we are rounding out this video. We have 2 more EQ mistakes to cover. This 5th mistake to avoid is kind of a fun one. This is being afraid to push it. And what I mean by that is that sometimes the task at hand, the mix requires us to make a move, or sound design task requires us to make a move with the EQ that might visually look extreme. It might look like we're taking things too far, but don't let your eyes and what you visually see on the screen trick you from making the right move that the mix requires or the sound design requires us to do to get the result we want. So, you know, I went through this project and I found a couple of instances where it looks like I'm doing something fairly extreme, but there was a good reason why I did it. So just to quickly run through these, here on my drum bus, I have it's a parallel compression chain. And in my wet signal, I actually ended up pulling out 12 or like 11 decibels of the mids on the signal that's being parallel compressed. And it looks extreme. I would never think that this would be the right answer, but it ended up being the best thing that sounded the best to let only the lows and the highs through on this parallel compression. It gave me the best result. Here's another one. I have this white noise. You'll see this fairly extreme curve that you see here in this EQ. Normally this would be something that I would shy away from, but if I saw this visually by itself, but you know, this is what the mix required. If I just solo this, and again, this is just for demonstration, I wouldn't normally just solo this sound and EQ it on its own, But take a listen to the difference between what this white noise has when I take the EQ off versus what it ended up sounding like when I made the EQ move. So you'll see in this case, even though this is a pretty extreme EQ curve, it actually sounds a lot more pleasant. It sounds better in the mix. And what you can do sometimes is turn off the spectrum analyzer and make the EQ move you need to make without looking at the spectrum. So if I solo this and I play it, turning off that spectrum analyzer can prevent you from letting your eyes trick you, right? You just do what the sound requires and you don't let yourself get too caught up in what it looks like. Just to find one more example, I have this perk bass here. I am boosting 6 decibels at 119 hertz. Now, if someone told me that was what the sound required before I listened to it, I would say that's crazy. That's going to make it way too muddy. It actually ended up being the best move for me to make. And again, if you turn that spectrum analyzer off, it can resist the temptation to let yourself get tricked with your eyes. Just use your ears, make the move that sounds best in the mix in the context of the rest of the song. And then when it's there, just trust your ears. Trust that it sounds good. All right, and so that takes us to the last EQ mistake to avoid, EQ mistake number 6, and that is EQing for volume instead of a change to the sound. This is a really, really tricky one. And what I want to do for this one actually is to get out of Ableton, and I want to go into a Reddit Ask Me Anything thread that Porter Robinson did about 6 or 7 years ago after his iconic album Worlds dropped. He went on Reddit, he did an Ask Me Anything, a bunch of people asked production questions, and he had some really epic responses. And there was one response that actually hits right on home for what we've been talking about in this video, and especially for this last mistake to avoid. Let me just search EQ here. Okay. So someone asked him about, some production questions, and he says, okay, I'm not really interested in production as much as I used to be, so on and so forth. And then he gives some suggestions. And this is kind of a famous response that he gave here in this AMA. It's really interesting. Before we get into mistake number 6, I want to just talk about the last sort of EQ mistake we talked about, which was being afraid to push things. When he says in point number 4, don't abide by hard mix down rules or mix with your eyes rather than your ears. I remember abiding so strictly to the rules I got from my old music production forums, and just so much of it was misinformation. That kind of goes to the same point we were just talking about. Make sure that you're trusting yourself and your ears when you're making a move. But let's get into this last EQ mistake, and I'm just going to read his response in point number 2 here because it sums up perfectly what this last mistake really means. Getting the relative volume levels of each instrument correct is a more important task than EQing. New producers often prefer a sound after it's been EQ'd, and in many cases it's only because the levels have changed. Let that sink in for a moment. When you boost a sound, if you boost the highs, boost the mids, boost the bass or whatever, it's going to sound better because 9 times out of 10, something louder sounds better. And when you're boosting frequencies, you're turning those frequencies up, and so you're turning the sound up. So the name of the game here is before we even reach for an EQ, we should try to just make sure that the volume of the instrument is properly balanced within the mix. And then if it still has a problem that we need to fix, and only if it has a problem that we need to fix, then jump in and do moves with an EQ, right? Do cuts, do boosts, whatever. Don't just let the EQ be the thing that you fundamentally go for whenever you want to try and fix a problem in the mix. Rely on volume first. Don't take it from me, take it from Porter Robinson. All right, guys, so that brings us to the end of our 6 EQ mistakes to avoid. Next time you're producing in your project, first of all, go through your projects that you're doing right now. Make sure you're not making any of these mistakes, or double check yourself a little bit. And then the next time that you reach for an EQ, be very intentional about what you're doing with that EQ. Try to keep these things in mind, and I promise you that you're going to get better results out of your EQ. You'll be more efficient. You'll make sure you're actually making your mixes better and not worse. So all right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.